everybody, welcome back up to the Vinyl Attic for another episode of Vinyl Fetish. I took a week off last week to do a video for my sociology channel about all the nations on Earth that have had female heads of state, female presidents, female prime ministers, things like that. I'll include the link to that video in the description of this one if you want to check it out. I'd appreciate it, especially if you share it. And I also wanted to say, before we go any further, I really appreciate all the support this channel has had. We have over 1,500 members. Subscribers, which for some people isn't a lot. For me, that's a lot. That's a lot of people watching this channel. I'd really appreciate it if you smash the like button or subscribe if you haven't subscribed, or share it with your friends and help the word spread about the love of vinyl. Okay, so we are doing this 100 albums that matter. This 100 albums that I, at least, think should be in your collection. I've been a record collector since I was tween. In the 1970s, I've got a massive collection, and I really wanted to save something special for number 50. We're halfway through the count. I wanted to save something special. We've had a Paul McCartney album, we've had a John Lennon album, we've had a George Harrison album, and we've had a Ringo Starr album. Now it's time for the thing that brings them together, the Beatles. And obviously, every Beatles album should be in your collection. I mean, you should have the Yellow Submarine soundtrack in your collection. You should have Rubber Soul and the American versions, and obviously, that's obvious. So I wanted to go with something that was a little less obvious, and something that is deeply meaningful to me, as many of these albums are. We're going to 1976 and the double album Rock and Roll Music. And there's quite a story behind this. And one of the reasons, look at that reflection of the light, the mylar, the thumbs on it, or the fingers holding the album cover. This is the back of their head. And then this is the gatefold, Rock and Roll Music. This record is controversial for reasons that we'll talk about, but also the reason it's meaningful for me is this thing that I'm holding in my hand is my first Beatles album. It comes out June 1976. I was a 12-year-old kid and just starting to discover the joy of the Beatles as a 12-year-old. This was out and new. I think I probably got it at Kmart. And I was off to the races with this album. So I want to talk about this album, and also want to put it in context about sort of what makes this record kind of controversial. Obviously, the Beatles were officially split up in 1970. Let It Be comes out as sort of their cardboard tombstone, as it was called, and then the solo albums really start filling the charts. In 1973. Once Alan Klein at Apple recognizes there's not going to be any more Beatles albums, he puts together the Red and the Blue compilation albums, which are dominating the charts. Like the Beatles are back on the charts. So the compilations sell. The double compilations definitely have a history of selling. Also, when we get to sort of 73, 74, there is a big 50s nostalgia thing happening. There's American Graffiti, there's Sha Na Na, there's Happy Days. In my elementary school in 7th grade, we had a sock hop because there was all this sort of 50s nostalgia happening, and kind of nostalgia. And for some weird reason, this album got kind of lumped into it, even though it's Beatles. And if you look at the style of it and the images that are in it, this right here, this looks like something from American Graffiti, right? This is not 1960s Sgt. Pepperland. This is 1950s American Graffiti. So the packaging of it is a little bit weird and sort of meant to kind of fool some people into this was part of the 50s nostalgia. I'm going to talk about the music for a second, but I got to talk about the album cover. The album cover was roundly hated, especially by the Beatles. John Lennon offered to do an album cover. The year before, in 1975, he'd had his rock and roll album that had a picture of the Fabs when they were back in Hamburg, including Pete Best. Pete Best in a smudge makes it on an album cover. John Lennon offered to design the album cover. Capitol said no. When he saw this album cover, he said it looked like a bad Monkees throwaway album cover. When Ringo saw it, he told Rolling Stone that it made the band look cheap. And even though it has this kind of embossed quality to it, you can't really tell here, but this is sort of raised. Like I used to put my 12-year-old thumbs on this cover. It has nothing to do with the 1950s. It's so It's just wrong. It's just wrong. In 1980, they split this double album up into two separate albums and had kind of a more, I don't know, more basic album cover when they split them up into two. But I wanted to talk about the music. This is sort of a theme record. It's the Beatles' rock and roll music. And so it covers the history, starting with Twist and Shout and ending on the end of side 4 with the Let It Be version of Get Back. And covers the history of the band through their sort of most rockinest tune, which means there's nothing from 1967 on this album. There's no peppery, All You Need Is Love psychedelia on this record. There's a big skip. It goes sort of from Revolver, and then there's a gap, and then we pick up with Hey Bulldog from the Yellow Submarine soundtrack, which was the first time a lot of people had access to that song, because not a lot of people, who were sort of second generation collectors had the Yellow Submarine soundtrack. And I remember it being one of my favorite songs on the album. It was also the first time that I'm Down, which was the B-side for Help, was on an LP, at least in an American or British LP. And the tracks that they used were the original mono mixes sort of turned into stereo in a very kind of clunky way. And George Martin, when they were putting this album together, George Martin, the Beatles producer, offered to remix these in proper stereo. And Capitol said, no, the Beatles want as they sounded when they originally came out. So there's some weird mixes on here that you might not be familiar with, especially if you grew up with the CDs or you grew up with the streaming. Some of this is like the original version of I Want to Be Your Man, for example, or Boys, Long Tall Sally. In fact, the stuff that was from the Long Tall Sally EP had never been released in Britain on an album. It's for the first time it's on here. And a lot of these were cover songs. Larry Parnes and Chuck Berry and Carl Perkins. A lot of it was the cover songs. You get one George Harrison written track, Taxman, which sounds so great on here. Some of the fades are right off the album. So Back in the USSR starts chapter side 4, and you hear the beginning of Dear Prudence. Like, they didn't bother. They just sort of went to the easiest thing available and found. But one of the reasons, so it's interesting sonically, and it's also interesting in how this fits together. So side 3 is sort of where you go from 65 and 66, Dizzy Miss Lizzie and Drive My Car, and then it ends with Revolution, which is kind of jarring when you go from I'm Down to Revolution. But I grew up hearing these songs in this order, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this album is it's something that's very common for what we would call second generation Beatle fans. First generation Beatle fans were there in the 60s. They saw them on Ed Sullivan. They dropped acid because Paul said they dropped acid. They, sang Hey Jude when it came on the radio. The first generation fans were there as the band was producing music. There's a bunch of us that may have been alive. Again, I was born in 1964, February, right when they landed in the United States. But I have a vague memory of being 5 and hearing Octopus's Garden. That's sort of my Beatles memory. But there's another generation of kids born a little bit later that discovered the Beatles in the 70s. And one of the reasons that we found our way to the Beatles was another band that was dominating the charts, a band called Wings, Paul McCartney's band. And there was a joke in the 1970s which said Paul McCartney was in a band before Wings because Wings was so huge by the time you hit the mid-70s. In fact, when this album came out, it was big. It was a huge seller, made it to number 2, which is kind of a big deal for a record of old music. Went to number 2. The reason it didn't go to number 1 is because Paul's album Wings at the Speed of Sound was locked into the number 1 spot the summer of 1976. I mean, I just have such specific memories of being at the pool as a 12-year-old kid and hearing silly love songs on the radio all the time, or Beware My Love on the radio. I mean, all those songs were just constant. This Wings was so huge. They were engaged in a big tour, the Wings Over America tour. So, in which they were playing some songs like Lady Madonna and Blackbird. I mean, some of those songs were coming back into circulation because of the revival that Paul inspired through the popularity of Wings. Wings was so dominant, and so a lot of people were like, Wings? Oh, he was in this other band. I should check it out. What are they? They're called the Beatles. Oh yeah, I think my parents know something about them. So there is a whole generation of us that were sort of Beatles '70s fans who fell in love with this album. It's never really been properly re-released. In fact, when they redid the double album as single albums in 1980, they did use the George Martin mixes. They didn't use the original mixes. They used the ones that George Martin prepared. And then after this, in 1977, the next Beatles record to come out was the Hollywood Bowl album, which was the first proper live album. There was also a Beatles at the Star Club that was kind of floating around at the time. But the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl, from the recordings of 64 and 65, were the first real live Beatles. And it sounds so great. George Martin did put those together, and they got a proper remixing after the recent Ron Howard movie came out about the Beatles tour, and that sounds really great. Again, this one has never been reissued as the original one. And then later in 1977, the Beatles' Love Songs, which was another double compilation albums that had some songs that were love songs and some that weren't, just the softer side of the Beatles, so like FM rock, easy listening version of the Beatles. So I wanted to do this one because it is there's a generation of Beatle fans that this is your record. This is the record that brought you to the band. This is the record that had you say, I should track some of these albums down. I should look into this Chuck Berry character. I should, check out Carl Perkins. And, one of the things about this record that was also very interesting is that one of the tracks that's on here, and if you want a rock and roll album, you need this track on, is Helter Skelter. And Helter Skelter was supposed to be the single off this album to help promote it. But the summer of 1976, there was a made-for-TV movie about Charles Manson. And the name for the movie was The Helter Skelter, in which they played a version of the Beatles' Helter Skelter, which supposedly, if you know the story, maybe we should do a whole video on this about how Charles Manson thought the Beatles were the four horsemen of the apocalypse when he heard the White Album. I'm never figuring out which one Ringo is. Maybe Pestilence. But the Charles Manson heard the White Album and thought it was the Beatles were telling him to launch a race war, and the Helter Skelter, which is actually a song about a slide in Brighton, a slide that we'd slide down, was about, a racial holocaust in America. He was wrong. So Capitol decided that connotation with Manson might not be good. So what they did do is they released another song that had never been a single as the single from the album, which is Got to Get You Into My Life. And this is the single from 1976, made it all the way up to number 6 on the charts. This song from, 10 years earlier, from 1966, from Revolver, makes it all the way up into the top 10 the summer of 1976, because everybody is going Beatle crazy all over again. The Beatles are back, baby. And of course, the other thing I wanted to say is this also fueled some of the most exciting and whimsical fantasies about a Beatle reunion. When this record comes out, it sort of starts people trying to lure them back into band formation, offering them millions of dollars to perform, to do benefits for UNICEF and for kids in Vietnam. And, there's all this sort of effort, like, we're going to get the Beatles back together, we're going to get the Beatles back together. And as a kid who became a fan of the Beatles during this period, that was the dream. That was the dream, that one day they will get together and play or record an album or just walk across Abbey Road or something, that the four of them will be together at some point. And of course, on December 8th, 1980, that was horribly shattered. The irony is that 1976 is the end of their contract with EMI Capitol, and they officially dissolve. In fact, I think John Lennon signed the papers in 1976 while he was at Disney World with Julian. That was the official end of the Beatles. But for many of us, this was the beginning. This was the beginning. All right. I wanted to give this album some love. In my mind, these songs will always fit together. I always think, back in the USSR, Helter Skelter, Taxman, Got to Get You in My Life, Hey Bulldog, Birthday, Get Back. Those songs all fit right together because that's how I first heard them. Great album. If you can find it, really, really, really loved by second generation. Okay, wanted to do that. So next, now we're into the second 50. of these albums, and I wanted to do another album that is very close to me, something that was deeply inspired by the Beatles, and also deeply connected to my life. It's about time we talk about the Bangles. We're going to talk about the Bangles. We're going to talk about the Bangles all over the place album, and why that album matters. And if you know anything about me, there might be a few stories to tell. On that one. All right. Thank you so much for hanging out with us through the first 50. We know the Beatles matter, right? I mean, they're still everywhere. Ringo has a country music album coming out in January. Paul is still performing. Like, the Beatles they will never not be around us somehow. So, but this album matters. Rock and roll music matters. You matter. So let's talk about it.